Good day and welcome to lesson 20 of this basic biblical Greek course. In today's lesson, we're going to begin with a recap of the subjunctive mood forms that we learned in the previous lesson. But then we're going to spend the bulk of our time looking at the uses of the subjunctive mood, which I'm very excited about and I'm sure you are going to enjoy thoroughly. And then we'll look at how "ou" and "may" are used in questions. And then I'll give you a summary of the Greek conditional clauses. This is something that one really only learns in intermediate Greek, but I think it'll be helpful for you to know what the different types of conditional clauses are in the Greek New Testament. So we'll just do an overview of them. And once we've done that, we'll learn some new vocabulary together and then do some translation work practicing the uses of the subjunctive mood. So if you are ready to get going, then grab a piece of paper and a pen and let's get going together. So let's do a quick recap of some of the things that we spoke about in lesson 19. Firstly, whereas the indicative is the mood of assertion, the subjunctive is the mood of probability. Secondly, while both verbal aspect and time are significant in the indicative mood, time becomes insignificant in the subjunctive mood. And this is because there is no concept of absolute time in this mood. So what are some of the implications? There is no augment in the aorist tense. Thirdly, there are only three tense forms: the primary, aorist, and perfect. Regarding the perfect subjunctive occurs only 10 times in the New Testament, and so we are not going to consider it right now and focus primarily on the primary and aorist tense forms. Keep in mind that there is no future subjunctive tense form. And then finally, remember the two key characteristics of the subjunctive mood. Firstly, all tenses take primary endings and have lengthened connecting vowels. Let's also do a recap of the subjunctive verb forms, beginning with the present active subjunctive. We have luo, lueis, luei, luomen, luete, luosin. The present middle passive subjunctive forms are luomai, luei, luetai, luometha, lueisthe, luontai. Moving on to the first aorist active subjunctive forms, we have luso, luseis, lusei, lusomen, lusete, lusosin. And now the first aorist middle subjunctive forms, we have lusomai, lusei, lusetai, lusometha, luseisthe, lusontai. And then we have the first aorist first passive subjunctive forms, beginning with lutho, lutheis, luthei, luthomen, luthete, and luthosin. And then please remember that the second aorist active and middle subjunctive verbs are formed exactly like the present tense, except for the characteristic stem change. So far in this basic biblical Greek course, we have learned the present indicative of eimi. We have learned the imperfect indicative of eimi, as well as the perfect indicative of eimi. And today we are looking at the subjunctive of eimi. And the first thing you need to know is that the subjunctive of eimi only has a present tense and that is because there is no concept of absolute time in the subjunctive mood. And then a helpful memory device is that the present subjunctive forms of a, me are the same as the present active endings, except there is no stem attached. So let me just remind you very briefly of the present active subjunctive forms. So we had luo, luace, lua, luomen, luate, luosin. But if we took away the stem, lu, we left with the subjunctive of a, me forms. So take a look on the right hand side. The first person singular is o. The second person singular is ace. Third person singular is a. First person plural is o men. Second person plural ate. Third person plural is o sin. Regarding their translation, we would translate o as I may be. Remember that this is a general translation guideline, and depending on the context, you might have to use words such as might, should, would, etc. The second person singular, ace, you may be. A, he may be. Omen, we may be. Ate, you may be. And finally, osin, they may be. So as you begin looking at the uses of the subjunctive mood, I'd like to do an overview first. So the subjunctive mood has a variety of uses in Greek. For now, we will focus on 8 primary uses. The first 4 uses occur in dependent clauses and the second 4 in independent clauses. So if you can't remember what a dependent clause is, I've just made a note here. Dependent clauses cannot stand alone as a complete thought. So when we speak about the use of the subjunctive verb in a dependent clause, what we are saying is that the verb will be functioning as the subordinate verb in the sentence. On the other hand, we have the second category, which is independent clauses. And independent clauses can stand on their own as a complete thought. So when we speak about the use of the subjunctive verb in an independent clause, we're saying that it is functioning as the main verb of that particular clause or sentence. So those are the 2 categories that we are going to work with. So regarding dependent clauses, we have 4 uses: the purpose, result, future conditions, and indefinite, relative, and temporal clauses. And then regarding the independent clauses, we have 4 uses. Firstly, hortatory, deliberative, prohibitory, and emphatic negation. So let's begin with the dependent clauses and work our way through each of the uses separately. The first subjunctive use with dependent clauses is purpose. The most common use of the subjunctive is when it follows the particle hina. Hina, or sometimes harpos, is used to indicate purpose. The purpose clause answers the question why, and it is usually translated as that, so that, in order that, or to. So let's look at 2 examples together. Firstly, from John 1 verse 7. John writes, Houtos elthen eis marturion hina martureise peri tu photos. So John wrote, he came as a witness. And then we can ask ourselves the question, why? And then we have hina. Hina here conveying purpose. So we translate it in order to, and then we have the subjunctive verb martureise that follows hina, and that fleshes out the purpose for which he came as a witness, to testify about the light. Let's do one more example together. This one comes from Ephesians 25:25-26. So Paul writes there, Hoi Andres agapate tas gunaikos kathos kai, ha Christos agapesen tein, eklesion kai auton paredoken hupe autes. So we translate that first verse 25 as, husbands, love your wives because Christ also loved the church and delivered himself for her. And then we can ask ourselves the question, why? And Paul answers that with the particle hina, which we've translated here as so that. And then the subjunctive verb hagease fully fleshes out that purpose, so that he might sanctify her. Secondly, in addition to purpose, hina is also sometimes used to express result. So what is the difference between purpose and result? The main difference is that a purpose clause is an intended result, and a result clause is something that already occurred, whether intended or not. The result clause is usually translated that, so that, or with the result that. So let's take a look at an example from the New Testament to see if we can draw out the distinction between purpose and result and make more sense of it. So here we have John 9 verse 2, where John writes, Eon tis hemarten hutas a hoi ganes autu hina tuflos gene the. And the ESV has rendered this as, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? So the question that we have to ask ourselves regarding hina is John using it to convey purpose or result? Well, I think a helpful second question to ask is, was the man already actually blind when the disciples asked Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents? And the answer is yes, he was already actually blind. And because of that, hina in John 9 verse 2 is conveying result. But let's now take a look at the next verse in John 9 verse 3. And I'm not going to read the Greek here. Let's just have a look at what the ESV has rendered the Greek text as. It says, Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. So once again, John uses hina, and we have to ask ourselves the question, is hina here communicating purpose or result? Or we could actually phrase it like this. What was God's intended result that this man be born blind? And the answer is that the works of God might be displayed. So here, hina is not being used to convey result. It's here being used to convey purpose. All right, so I hope that these two verses help to clarify what is meant by result and purpose. Before we look specifically at future conditions, I'd like to give you some context and tell you what conditional statements are. So a conditional statement is an if-then sentence. In other words, I could say something like, if I need wisdom, I will pray daily. So we call the if clause the protasis and the then clause the apodosis. Now, traditionally, grammarians have classified Koine Greek into four classes of conditional sentences as first class, second, third, and fourth class. Now, there is much to say about the nature of these conditional clauses, and I'll do a summary of them with you at the end of this lesson. But at this stage, we will only deal with the third class conditional clause because it involves the subjunctive mood. And this third class conditional clause is quite common and occurs about 300 times in the New Testament. So let's give it a definition. A third class conditional sentence expresses a probable, though hypothetical, future condition. A third-class conditional sentence expresses a probable, though hypothetical, future condition. So furthermore, third-class conditional sentences always have a protarsis, and the protarsis specifically is the if-dependent conditional clause, which is introduced by aeon. We can translate that as if, or aeon may, unless. And here is the key, and a verb in the subjunctive mood. Then the verb in the apodosis specifically is the resulting set of circumstances if the condition in the protarsis has been met, and can be any tense or mood. So let's take a look at two examples from the Greek New Testament. The first one is John 8 verse 51. So here we have aeon, which is also a clue that the subjunctive is coming. So aeon, tis, ton, emon, logon, and then we have the subjunctive verb te rese. So that whole clause is what we call the protarsis, the dependent conditional clause, and it can be translated as if anyone keeps my word. And the second part of John 8:51 is thanaton ou me theorese eiston iona. So that clause is the apodosis, the probable future result, and can be translated as he will never see death ever. Just notice here that ou me theorese is a emphatic negation, and that's why we've translated it as he will never see death. Let's do one more example together. This time it comes from John 3:3, and here we have eon me tis genethe anothen. So that clause, once again, is called the protarsis. It can be translated as unless. So eon me we translate as unless someone is born again. And then John carries on, ou dunatai idain tain basileon tu theu. So that is our apodosis. It can be translated as he cannot see the kingdom of God. So the main thing that I want you to know is that third-class conditional clauses have a protarsis that is introduced by aeon or aeon may with a verb in the subjunctive mood, and then the apodosis can be any tense or mood. Let's now look at the fourth use of the subjunctive verb with definite clauses, and this is the indefinite relative and temporal clauses. So let's firstly speak about the indefinite relative clause. So it says here, the subjunctive is used after the indefinite relative pronouns hostis with on or aeon, or hos and on. These constructions generally indicate a generic or indefinite subject. That is, they make a relative pronoun, for example, who, indefinite or uncertain. So we would translate it as whoever. So let's take a look at an example which comes from Acts 2 verse 21. So here Luke says hos on, which we translate as whoever, and on is a clue that the subjunctive is coming, and that indeed does happen, and we have epikalesetai, which we translate as calls on. And then let's have a look at the temporal clause, and when you hear the word temporal, I want you to think time. That's why I've put it in brackets there. So what is the temporal clause? The subjunctive is also used after the temporal conjunction hoton, or after a temporal adverb or preposition. So here are some common examples. We have heos, akri, or mekri. and is typically translated whenever. So our example comes from 1 Corinthians 3 verse 4. So there Paul uses hoton, which we translate as whenever, and that also tells us that the subjunctive is coming. So we have legate in the subjunctive mood, and we translate that as says. So for whenever someone says, I'm with Paul, and another, I'm with Apollos, are you not typical men? I think it's appropriate to quickly take stock and do a summary of the dependent clauses before we move on to the independent clauses. So far we've looked at 4 uses of the subjunctive verb when found with independent clauses. The first was the purpose, and here's a short summary. The subjunctive verb follows the particle hina, or sometimes harpos, and expresses purpose. Purpose, remember, is more the intended result of the action. And then we had result. Result also follows the particle hina, or sometimes harpos, and expresses result. Result, on the other hand, is that which already actually occurred. Then we looked at the future conditions, and the future condition is when the verb follows the particle eon or eon may and is used in the protasis, which is the if condition of a third-class sentence. And then finally, we looked at the indefinite relative and temporal clauses. So firstly, the indefinite relative clause is used after the indefinite relative pronouns hostis, on or eon, or hos on, and we can translate that as whoever. And then the temporal clauses are used after the temporal conjunction hoton, or after a temporal adverb or preposition. Heos, akri, mekri, etc., and is typically translated whenever. Now that we have done the dependent clauses, let's move on to the subjunctive uses with independent clauses. The first subjunctive use with independent clauses is the hortatory subjunctive. Hortatory comes from the Latin word hortor, meaning I exhort. So it is used when the author wants to command his audience, but also include himself in the particular course of action. So the hortatory subjunctive then is an exhortation in the first person plural, and it should be translated with the words let us before the verb. Context is always king, so simply because you find a subjunctive verb as a first person plural doesn't necessarily mean it's functioning as a hortatory subjunctive. The context should determine that. But let's look at 2 examples together where the subjunctive first person plural is functioning as a hortatory subjunctive. The first example comes from Galatians 6 verse 10, where Paul writes, erga zometha ta agathon pros pantos. So we've been used to translating this quite literally. So we could literally translate this as we should do good to everyone. But instead, because Paul's including himself in the exhortation, it's preferable to translate this as a hortatory subjunctive, where we use the words let us do good to everyone. And the second example from 1 John 4 verse 7 that follows the same principle. John writes, agapomen allelus, and once again we translate this first person plural subjunctive as let us love one another. The next use is what we call the deliberative subjunctive. The first point I want to make here is that the deliberative and hortatory subjunctives both use the first person without hina or eon preceding. So you won't find hina or eon coming before the first person subjunctive. Now, what is the difference between these two? While the hortatory subjunctive expresses an exhortation to do something, the deliberative subjunctive asks what the speaker should do. Asks what the speaker should do. Hence, it asks a question. And it can be two types of questions. It can be a real question or a rhetorical question. So let's take a look at an example of the real question first. So here, the speaker is typically asking for some sort of guidance and therefore expects an answer. The use of the subjunctive signifies some uncertainty about the answer though. So here's an example from Matthew 26 verse 17 where Jesus is asked this question: where do you want us to prepare the Passover so you may eat it? So this is it's a genuine, it's a real question that's been asked by the disciples, posed at Jesus, to which the disciples did not know the answer. So the subjunctive, etoi masomen, shows or signifies some uncertainty about the answer on the part of the disciples. They really weren't sure, and that's why they asked Jesus so they could expect to receive an answer from him. Now, on the other hand, the deliberative subjunctive can also ask a rhetorical question. And a rhetorical question is one that does not expect an answer. So this is why an author would use a rhetorical question, because this type of question is not one in search of facts, but is a veiled challenge to the readers to change their behavior or thinking. All right, so it's a real powerful way to get an audience to think about their current behavior or thinking, and they are being challenged to change whatever they might be doing wrong. So here is a very well-known example from Romans 6 verse 1, where Paul writes in the Greek, epimenomen te hamartia hina he charis pleonase. And we translate that as, should we continue in sin in order that grace may multiply? So it is evident that Paul is not seeking information, because his immediate response in the next verse is absolutely not. He uses a prohibition, me genoita. So Paul is not really asking if we should continue in sin in order that grace may multiply. Instead, he is urging his readers to see that it is not morally acceptable for them to willfully continue to sin against God. So it's a veiled challenge to his readers to change their behavior or their thinking. The third subjunctive use with independent clauses is the prohibitory. The prohibitory is when the aorist subjunctive is used with may to prohibit an action and should be translated as a simple command. So when you see may with an aorist subjunctive verb, then this should indicate to you that it is a prohibition, and we should translate it as a simple command. So let's look at two examples together. The first one comes from Matthew 5 verse 17, where Jesus says, may nomistete. Right, so may is the negative particle, and it is accompanied by an aorist subjunctive. So we translate this as a simple command. Do not think. And then the rest you are familiar with, I'm sure. And then the second example comes from John 3 verse 7, where once again we have may, thou mases, which is also an aorist subjunctive. So this is a prohibition, and translated as a simple command, we could say, do not marvel because I said to you. And then the last use of the subjunctive is one that we've already done. We covered this in the previous lesson, so this is essentially just a bit of revision. Just remember that the emphatic negation is expressed by the double negative u may. U is a negative particle that is always found with the indicative mood, and may is a negative particle that's found outside of the indicative mood. But when they are used together in the same verse with an aorist subjunctive, then the author is using emphatic negation. In other words, it's the strongest way to say no in Greek. And it is often translated as never, certainly not, or absolutely not. So here's an excellent example from Hebrews 13, verse 5b, where the author writes, "U me se ano, ud u me se eg katalipo." Eg katalipo, which the ESV translates as, "I will never leave you nor forsake you." And I've just added in brackets there, never. And some commentators note that this verse is perhaps the most powerful verse in the Bible due to the fact that it contains 5 negatives. So 2 emphatic negations. The first one is u me ano, and the second emphatic negation is u me eg katalipo. And we also have the negative conjunction in the midst there, ud. So 5 negatives expressed in this one clause, and just reminding us that God will not leave us nor forsake us. A real encouragement to ponder. Let us quickly do a summary now of the subjunctive uses with independent clauses. So we first looked at the hortatory. This is when the author commands his audience, but also includes himself in the command, and we normally translate that as "let us." The next one was the deliberative, and this asks a real or a rhetorical question. The real question expects an answer. The rhetorical question does not expect an answer. The third use was the prohibitory. This is when the aorist subjunctive is used with the may to prohibit an action and should be translated as a simple command. And then the last use was the emphatic negation. And this is expressed by the double negative u may plus an aorist subjunctive, and it strongly denies that something will happen. In this next section of this lesson, I'd like to teach you how u and may are used in questions. So let's begin with may first. Though may is normally used with a subjunctive mood, it is also used with the indicative mood in a question to indicate that a negative answer is expected. So here's an example from 1 Corinthians 12 and the first part of verse 29. So you see Paul writes here, me pantes apostoloi, me pantes prophetai. So we could translate this as, all are not apostles, are they? All are not prophets, are they? Now Paul doesn't give us the answer, but because he uses may with the indicative, the implied or the expected answer is no. And then conversely, when u begins a question in the indicative mood, it implies that a positive answer is expected. So here's a simple example from John 6, beginning of verse 42, where John writes, "Uch," which is a form of u, "hutos estin Iesus," which we could translate as, "is not this Jesus?" And the implied answer for this question is yes, because a form of u is being used with the indicative. So let's take a look at a summary of the Greek conditional clauses, the if clauses. As I mentioned to you earlier, there are four classes. So the first class is marked by the conditional particle a. Then regarding the protarsis, the tense is any, the mood is indicative, and an example is Matthew 18:18. And then the apodosis, the tense and the mood can be any. And then the meaning of the first class conditional clause is this: the speaker or writer presents the protarsis as true for the sake of the argument. So if he says if, what he means by that is, and let us assume that this is true. And then the second class conditional clause is also marked by the conditional particle a. The tense in the protarsis this time is either the imperfect, the aorist, or the pluperfect, and the mood is once again the indicative. An example there is Matthew 11 verse 23. And then in the apodosis, the tense is also imperfect, aorist, or pluperfect. The mood, however, is on plus the indicative, but sometimes on is not present. And then the meaning of the second class conditional clause is this: the condition is contrary to fact. So if this writer says if, what he means by that is, and I, the speaker, do not think this is true. And then we've looked at the third class conditional clause, but remember that the conditional particle is on, or sometimes on may. The tense is any, but the mood is the subjunctive. So that's what sets the third class conditional clause apart, or makes it different from all the others. And an example there is Revelation 22:19. And the apodosis, the tense and the mood are any. And then here's a quick summary of the third class conditional clause. The event in the protarsis is presented more hypothetically by the speaker. It is more tentative than the first class conditional. And then finally, the fourth class conditional clause is also marked by the conditional particle a. And both the protarsis and the apodosis have tense that are any of the tense forms, and the mood is the optative. Regarding the meaning, the event is a remote possibility. However, there is no complete example of a fourth class conditional sentence in the Greek New Testament. So most of the conditional clauses that we will come across in the Greek New Testament are either first, second, or third class clauses. So our first word for today is on, which is a contingency particle. And if you were to translate it, you could use the English equivalent ever. But normally on is found with indefinite relative pronouns or temporal pronouns, and it's translated as whoever or whenever. Our next word is eperotao, and that is I ask or demand. Next we have phobeomai, I fear, I'm afraid. Then manthano, I learn. Then mede, and not even. Next we have oida, which is I know. And then we have hopos. If you remember, this can also be used to indicate purpose, and we translate it as in order that. Then we have aros, ta, which is mountain. Then we have hoton, whenever. Next we have paidion ta, child or infant. Then we have timao, I honor. Second to last, topos ha, place. And finally, huparko, I am, I exist. Just two more words, as I couldn't fit them all on the same slide. We have epi, which is a preposition. So it can mean upon, near, before, over, on the basis of with the genitive, or at, by, or on with the dative, or across, to, or against with the accusative. So as you can see, this preposition has many variations of ways that you can translate it. And then lastly, we have chronos ha, which means time. Our principal parts for this lesson, we're looking at principal parts 7, 8, and 9. Just remember that our goal is not to memorize the principal parts, but to become familiar with them. So that's why we look at 3 principal parts in every lesson. Remember that our tense forms are the present, the future active middle, aorist middle active, aorist passive, perfect active, and perfect middle passive. So let's begin with akuo, which means here. So we have akuo, akuso, akusa, akusthein, ak ka'a, and ake ka mai. Remember that forms in parentheses do not occur in the New Testament. The next word is alasso, which means change. Then we have alaxo, alaxa, alagain, alaka, and alagmai. And then we have hamarteno, which is sin. Then we have hamarteso, hamarton, or hamartesa. So 2 principal parts for the aorist active middle. Then we have hamartethein, hamarteka, and hamartemai. So our first translation today is actually a scripture. It's 1 John 4 verse 7. And it reads as follows. Agapetoi, agapomen, alelus, hoti, he, agape, ek tu theu estin. So translation, beloved, let us love one another because love is of or from God. Let's make 1 or 2 observations here from the text. Firstly, let's look at this verb over here. It is a present, active, subjunctive, first person, plural. And if you haven't noticed already, this is a subjunctive that is functioning as a hortatory subjunctive, where the author is including himself in the exhortation that he's given. And that's why we translate it with the words, let us love one another. Then this word allelus, I've put in brackets here because we haven't learned the vocab for it yet. It means one another. And then we have hoti, hey agape. Hey agape is functioning as the subject. And then we have estin, which is the linking verb. And the linking verb, if you remember, links the subject to its predicate. So our predicate here is tu theu. Now you might be wondering to yourself, well, I thought the predicate had to be in the nominative case, and it normally is. So why is it now in the genitive case? And the answer is because it is the object of the preposition ek. And ek takes its object in the genitive case. That's why tu theu is in the genitive case. So we can actually call this a predicate genitive. Let's take a look at our second example together. The text reads as follows. Hos an pa ek tu hudatos ha ego echo u me zetese auta palin. Translation: whoever should drink from the water that I have will never seek it again. Let's make some observations here. Firstly, we see this construction has on, and that is the indefinite relative use of the subjunctive. So we translate that as whoever, making the relative pronoun indefinite. And the on tells us that the subjunctive is coming. So PA is a subjunctive verb, which we translate as should drink from the water. And then we have ha, which is a relative pronoun. Now, initially, you might think that it's referring back to hudatos, but it cannot be because it's not in the genitive case, and a relative pronoun must agree with its antecedents in case, gender, and number. So if it doesn't refer back to hudatos, how is it functioning in this sentence? Well, it actually is functioning as the direct object, because it's in the accusative case, of the verb echo. So it's a direct object of the verb echo, which we translate echo as I have. And then we have egoia, which we haven't translated, and that is a first person personal pronoun, first person singular, which is I. So it's there for emphasis, which we don't necessarily have to translate. And then we have this construction. I'm sure you're aware of it by now. U may with a aorist subjunctive. And that is a emphatic negation. So to render that as emphatic, we have translated it as will never seek it again. So we have time for one more translation example. So the Greek text reads as follows: U gar apestelen ha theos ton huion auton eis ton cosmon hina klenei ton cosmon. So our translation: for God did not send the Son himself into the world so that he should be judging the world. This verb apestelen is a first aorist, active, indicative, third person singular from apostello. Then we have the subject ha theos, because it's in the nominative case. And then this third person personal pronoun auton is standing in the predicate position, and it's there for emphasis. That's why we translate it as himself. And then the big thing that I want to quickly just bring to your attention is the particle hina. Remember, it's a clue. Beep, beep, beep tells us that the subjunctive is coming. So the verb krenei is in the subjunctive mood. But the big question that I want to leave you with here is hina. Is it communicating purpose or result? And my friends, I'm not going to answer that question for you. I want you to think based on what we've learned in this lesson. I want you to decide for yourself, is it functioning as purpose or is it communicating result? God bless you as you continue on this journey of learning this beautiful language, Koine Greek.